interviewing, just as an aside, but it's not really an aside, this is sort of a core piece of the discussion, is like anything else, right? It's like basketball. Like, what makes a good basketball player? Well, which position are they playing, right? What is the other team, right? If they're boxers, like styles make fights, right? It's like, okay, just because A beats B and B beats C doesn't mean A is going to beat C, right? I mean, it really depends on styles. And if you look at salespeople, what makes a good salesperson? Well, what are they selling, right? Some people are so charismatic and have this reality distortion field that people want to befriend them and they'll buy from them as a result of that. Some people are super, super technical and kind of dispassionate in a way. And others are really good at deal structure and figuring out conditional purchase orders and kind of navigating the wants and needs of the other person and being very, very creative in how to structure a purchase, maybe finance a purchase, right? These are all different characteristics and different skill sets, yet all of them could be exceptionally good salespeople, right? The same thing is true in podcasting, right? If you want to grow your podcast, like turn yourself into a super hot woman and talk about blowjobs. I've seen a few podcasts that have done really well by doing that. In addition to many other things that you have to get right, that is sort of not necessary, but not sufficient. I wouldn't say it's necessary, but you can't do that, Chris. You could. I don't know. Maybe you'd find a market for it, but that's not going to work for you. If I tried to be Joe Rogan with his knack and talent and developed skill for comedy, it would fall flat. I'm not going to try to be Joe Rogan. James Lipton, when he ran Inside the Actor Studio, never deviated from his questions. He had his list of questions. They were stacked in order on these blue cards, and he would never deviate. Even if there was a side door to a topic that could be more interesting, he would not take that side door. Now, some people might judge that harshly and say, well, that's stupid. He should have taken the side door. Well, does anyone know your podcast? A lot of people know Inside the Actor Studio. Seems to have worked pretty well. Maybe that format was exactly what he needed. Then you have folks who come in with meticulous notes. Right? I come in with lots and lots and lots and lots of notes. That works for me. Larry King came in blind. Right? Larry King, who also, one could say, was early to the radio game in the same way that some people were early to the podcast game. So you have to take that into consideration and maybe discount things a little bit. But he would come in with beginner's eyes to ask the naive questions that a listener might want to ask. He didn't want to know more than the listener or the viewer. Right? So this is all to say, becoming a better interviewer is really becoming your best self as an interviewer. But no matter what, reviewing transcripts for me is a core piece of that. And collecting questions. I remember I would effectively have not a 3-ring binder, but a collection of questions. I would take photographs on my phone. Pre-COVID, certainly, if you're taking flights, it'd be the only time that I read magazines. And you look at these in-flight magazines, there are always interviews. And if I found a good question, I would take a photograph and I would test it. If I listened to a podcast and I heard a good question, I would note it. I've been interviewing people for hiring for a new position recently, and someone I was interviewing, I solicited questions and they said, how do you give feedback? Could you give me a few examples of when people have disappointed you and how you've handled that? And I thought to myself, holy shit, that's a good question. I might steal that one. So be a collector and a tester of questions also.
So I have a bunch, I'm like going back, like, man, I have a bunch of follow-ups here.
Yeah, let's do it.
Backing up to the prep, how long are you spending, let's go back to if you were doing this all on your own, preparing for an interview?
It depends on the interview, but I would say generally minimum a few hours. So let's just call it minimum 2 to 4 hours. And I have some approaches for that I can share. And maximum, for instance, if there is a possible big break interview And one of those for me was Arnold Schwarzenegger. When that finally came together, I spent probably 4 or 5 days digesting everything about Arnold Schwarzenegger. I mean, watching interviews, watching movies, reading books, going through every past interview I could find. I wanted to be the best prepared interviewer he had ever met, basically. And therefore, I took it very, very seriously. But if we're talking about on the average side, let's just assume that's 3 to 4 hours. Now I spend less time because I have help and I have cultivated a system and also improved the system with the input of team members, how to prepare research documents. I would say 2 to 4 hours. I will also ask guests to send their favorite 2 to 3 long form interviews. I will ask them, and not all guests are keen to do this, but some are very keen, for exploratory topics or questions that they think could be fun for us and the audience, and anything else that they would like to send. So I open that door, and all of those things are received typically weeks or months in advance, because the editorial calendar is built out quite far in advance. At least these days, it is. If you're doing prep from scratch, if the person has a Wikipedia page, I look for the strangest or most esoteric / tiny unusual mention in Wikipedia, and I do a deep dive on that point. And I go into these citations. I will certainly look at social. This is important because, for instance, in between the time that you book a guest and you record, they could have a family member die. They could have any number of things happen. They could have some type of disaster in the press. You want to be aware of what is going on. So I don't spend a lot of time on social, but I will check in and go back at least a month or two to ensure that I have a basic understanding of what is on their minds and hearts. That doesn't take very long. I would say that's less than 30 minutes. So you have Wikipedia and then long form interviews. So I will look at print. I will start print, meaning text, long form text interviews. I will look at the interviews that they've sent. And that helps me in a number of different ways. It shows me where they're good. It shows me where they stall out or don't have answers. It also helps me to gather what I consider greatest hits stories. And here's what I mean by that. We all have stories that we have told more than once. Just like comedians who have worked on their material and refined over and over again, that 60-minute special, we all have stories that over time we have determined get a great response. And I want to know what those are. And sometimes I'll ask them point blank, either in prep or while we're doing the warm up in the beginning. I'll say, hey, is there a story that I can cue? I don't want to hear the story now, but a story that's really funny or that always gets a response from audiences. Maybe you've done a lot of speaking engagements. It's something that people always come up to you and mention. Is there any story or anecdote or metaphor, could be anything, parable that comes to mind? And oftentimes they'll say, let me think about that. Yeah, there is. Okay, ask me about the time that X. Ask me about when I was in college and Y happened. Great. I will plant one of those greatest hits stories within the first 10 minutes, if I have one of those, to pull people in and hopefully pass the driveway test, as I heard someone from NPR put it, which is when, and this happens with podcasts too, when you're listening to it in the car and you've got 10 or 20 minutes left and you get home and you just have to finish it. So you stay in the car, in the driveway, and you listen to the end. I think it's helpful to plan that through. So those are a few of the ways that I do research. If we have any common friends, or acquaintances, I will also ask them for topics and questions they think might be fun or that might take us on the road less traveled. And I used to do this more than I do now, but I will sometimes post it to social and ask what types of questions people would love me to ask. Given the size of my audience on social now, that makes less and less sense because it's very hard to filter, very hard to gather them. I will sometimes do that, but not terribly often.